Now, though, Marlon, this is President Cyril Ramaphosa, of course, announcing that stimulus package of R500 billion to tackle the economic effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, it amounts, as I said, to about 10% of the country's GDP and includes a 50 billion rand shot in the arm for social grant patients. Ramaphosa says the overall package is historic and says government will spare no expense to protect its people. Joining us now via Skype to discuss the president's economic strategy is Economist Professor Adrian Saville. Thanks very much, Prof, for your time. Welcome to Newzroom Afrika. I heard a lot of people, for instance, reacting to just the scale of this package. But I guess it's worth understanding that the 500 billion rand isn't necessarily all in the form of a cash injection. Some of it, for instance, is a relief package for taxpayers. Take us through, whether broadly speaking you feel that it hits the right places.
I think one of the key issues that it does is it squares up to uncertainty. In the current environment, one of the biggest sources of anxiety is just the unknowability of the circumstance. What is may look like for many people is a very scary, terrifying financial prospect. And for others, May is even, too far. So what the package does in the immediate circumstance is it brings a sense of knowability. It helps bring confidence into a very, very murky environment. Is it enough? It is substantially more than many people had anticipated, and it's not as much as others had asked. Kasata, for instance, was looking for a 1 trillion package. But, I think that the key point is it's multifaceted. It squares up to some of the most fragile parts of the social infrastructure, and it helps look after business and jobs alongside broad society.
You speak about confidence. I'm looking now, the rand is trading at about 19.05 to the dollar. It's slightly weaker than it was yesterday, and I'm sure there's a whole lot of reasons for that, which you'll touch on. But as you do that, we've come to learn, for better or for worse, that there's no such thing as a free lunch. And we're already hearing the president, for instance, approaching the IMF, the World Bank, etc., etc. Under what conditions do you think assistance from those institutions should not be accepted?
Look, perhaps it's worth going the other way around and asking under what circumstances would they lend to us. It's us going to them, asking for support rather than them desperately looking around for places to allocate capital. And there is a moment here for South Africa to introspect. A lot of the narrative around this has been about the ratings agencies putting South Africa down a notch at an extraordinarily difficult time, about the critical need to fund state-owned enterprises and that we're obliged to choose between lives and livelihoods. I think what shouldn't be lost in this is not the importance of lives and livelihoods. Neither should be compromised, but that it was South Africa that got ourselves into this financial circumstance. Rewind 10 years, we were boasting 3-4% economic growth. Unemployment was still elevated but substantially lower. We had one of the strongest government balance sheets in the world. Our state-owned enterprises were well funded and well running. So there may well be circumstances that those multilateral agencies put on South Africa. I think South Africa should be ensuring that circumstances of discipline and delivery, or the obligations of discipline and delivery, are self-imposed.
Right. And, we really are spoiled for choice about, aspects that we can hone into from the president's address yesterday. But let's spend some time mulling over the strategy to help spaza shops, right? About 2 billion rand set aside for SMMEs as well as these type of entrepreneurs. But they operate largely in the informal sector. I wonder what the best way to administer the distribution of these funds will be, given perhaps the lack of structures in that type of sector.
To informal businesses, micro enterprise, that does bring problems, not impossible, but it brings problems or challenges. Alongside thinking about the impacts for spazas specifically, recognize that we already have a substantial social welfare infrastructure that will be used to deploy key parts of this funding. Most obviously, the child welfare grant is a core part of this relief package. And all of that infrastructure is in place. The disbursements are in cash or near cash, and by which I mean digital electronic, and those payments are likely to have a very direct and relatively quick effect in terms of helping provide business to, amongst others, spaza shops, large sectors of the township economy.
The strategy to also, I think, bolster the assistance to social grants recipients will be most received well in most quarters of society, mostly because, a big part of trying to boost the economy is to make sure that people have disposable income to spend. Do you think it'll go far enough?
Well, yes. Look, it went further than we've ever been before, and it brings critical relief in a time when there is growing anxiety, growing stress, growing evidence of social anguish and social pain. So I think it does take us much further than we had anticipated. Is it enough? No. For it to be enough, we want everyone to be in work with meaningful incomes and security around housing, food, sanitation, and more. That to me would be that we've gone far enough. But we don't have that fiscal space. We simply don't have that fiscal space. So what I think, to be sort of a bit of a grumpy voice in this broadly very receiving and grateful environment is I think it equips us to impress on recipients of relief, whether it's business, whether it's taxpayers, whether it's welfare recipients, that these are temporary measures, that they don't change reality forever, and that the way that reality is changed is by us fixing the structure of the economy, not through us getting onto a unsustainable welfare wagon.
You speak about changing the reality. Municipalities are seen, for instance, as a very good vehicle of trying to do that, particularly for grassroots communities. They're said to be receiving about 20 billion rand and very real concerns about whether this money will be used for its intent, particularly given our history. How do we navigate that dynamic, if we can at all, really?
Well, again, to go back to my previous point about it was South Africa that got us into this circumstance. The performance of municipalities, certainly from a financial perspective, is a long way off the ask. And we're now going to go into the business of distributing more funds to municipalities that, on balance, have not delivered what was required. So I would put a big question mark over this as a channel to get funds into the system, part A. And part B, if we are good at getting funds into the system, will those funds transfer into delivery at the level of families and households? And we've seen a number of recent reports about the missing infrastructure and the impact that missing infrastructure has on families. Recent story, news story on a village in Limpopo where there's been no access to running water for a year. So if you've got no access to running water, one of the residents says, how am I supposed to wash my hands? I understand the importance of social distancing. I understand the threats and risks of COVID-19, but I don't have running water. It's municipalities that are responsible for delivering that.
Absolutely. Now, a lot of people will be looking for, call it the masterstroke in the president's sort of economic package announced yesterday. Already a few people suggesting that, the tax relief for those who donate to the Solidarity Fund might be one of those, sort of a two-pronged approach of trying to address the multiplicity of issues we're facing. Do you think that's the case? Do you think that's probably the best move to come out of the economic relief package announced yesterday?
Well, someone's going to have to pay for this. This isn't money for free. You've already made the point, Ayanda. We're talking about 500 billion in relief. That's not necessarily 500 billion in new spending. For instance, one component is the guarantee fund, and that doesn't represent spending. It represents a guarantee measured as 200 billion. But all said and done, someone is going to have to pay for that, and that someone is you and us as the taxpayer. So if we're talking about tax cuts as a masterstroke, and we're talking about fresh spend, we also need to be figuring out where the money comes from in this new environment. And if you're talking about tax cuts, it then has to be that there is an elevated growth story. So that would need to be the masterstroke then. Tax cuts in and of themselves isn't going to solve the problem. If anything, it might leave some part of the question unanswered. So to me, the masterstroke is about the prospect of delivering on Tito Mbowene's structural adjustment proposals.